In the world we all live, we consume the news each day across numerous digital media sources. What we do not know is the fact that each of our opinions are being influenced. Even the type of media we consume are always watching over us, the way we discuss about politics and its history. From BBC Parliament to on-the-go radio coverage, we consume the political news because the political spectrum has something which may surprise us all, especially through Prime Minister questions. Even if TV's coverage of the House of Commons began in 1989, thousands of the public still tune in for discussing different issues and bills from the House of Lords, which began TV coverage in January 1985 and radio coverage since 1975 via BBC Radio 4. However, to make sense of the history of media and politics, we must first travel all the way back to how things began. During the 19th and 20th centuries, the only way we had to keep up to date with what was happening was through newspapers. And during the 19th century, handed writing allowed newspapers to print the report on political news, so no one was left out on pieces of vital news information. 2nd of July 1802 saw the first handed writing from the House of Commons, which gave us a report on what was happening in the sitting of the House of Commons. Before long, the public was shielded from knowing what was going on behind closed doors. However, 22nd of November 1803 gave us the first Hansard report, which also gave a true account on the King's speech, which was staggered at 8,467 words, on which at the time the Honourable Cropley Ashley spoke about the addition of the British Empire and its countries. House of Commons first discussed the introduction of television cameras and transmitting proceedings in the House of Commons in 1964. October 1972 and February 1975, however, all three of those debate was ending in a vote for against TV cameras due to worry concerns that this would be television trivialising. However, the House of Lords on 8th of December 1983 paved the way for the future of television experiment. The then leader of the Lords at the time explained that while 60s was the decade of colour television, that became the 80s most important and influential medium of communication. However, the urge of TV broadcasting ended when the 23rd of January 1985 saw the permanent fixture of TV coverage from the Lords. Then 1989 saw the first televised coverage from the House of Commons, which in that year was Maggie Thatcher's last term as Prime Minister. Having been re-elected the second time in 1987 following her first re-election in 1983, that was when TV, radio and newspapers came together to open and report more political stories, with one more yet to be added. However, the BBC and ITV at the time decided to go way early and ahead of schedule, with the beginning points of political broadcasting from commercial broadcasting to non-stop broadcasting. This is how proper TV political coverage began across two major broadcasters. TV coverage has been around for more than 100 years, and in fact, the turning point of political coverage on TV was in the 1950s, when the BBC secured permission for a factual programme on the results of the 1955 general election. This afterwards was paving way for more coverage, as during the 50s the show called In the News featured a political debate, and this therefore gained traction. ITV/ITN. The main rival didn't start coverage due to launching well after the BBC began their TV coverage. However, in the 50s and early 60s saw initial resistance to extensive political coverage on television. Since then, the general election in 1960 saw extension of political reporting and coverage, particularly when it came to political neutrality and biased, non-biased media type on TV. Mind you, ITV is the main broadcaster, which has the advertising money sorted with 16 different regional variants. There are more to be added over time, and soon came 3 more channels, which one has non-stop coverage of parliamentary coverage. BBC Parliament is the main point of call for every single coverage, including the increase of impact due to the audience needs and ratings, which every week this gets around 120,000 viewers with a weekly point of contact through PMQs, and why this impact goes through into its history. Question time viewing figures varies from depending on the audience numbers every week. except when Parliament is in recess. This was known as the first parliamentary channel in 1992. In reasoning was to provide live pre-recorded footage from the British Parliament. Following the purchase of the channel by the BBC, the 23rd of September 1998 saw the launch of the BBC Parliament channel. However, due to the capacity limitation on digital terrestrial, now known as Freeview, this channel, from launch until 15th of October 2002, ran as an audio only, meaning not seeing what was going on but hearing proceedings inside Westminster. That all changed when on the 14th of October 2002 saw the introduction of quarter-screen broadcast. However, after backlash from thousands of perplexed emails and letters from the public and questions from the MPs, not to mention inside the House itself, 13th of November 2006 finally saw the BBC Parliament channel find its bandwidth to broadcast on full screen. It is now home to full screen broadcast and continues to do so for future generations. GB News first began broadcasting in June 2021, and their goal is to provide original news, debates, options that matters to us in this day. However, this channel has been criticised for lack of reporting impartiality, and this channel always gets in regular trouble with Ofcom, who are regulators of partiality. This is due to them reporting / leaning towards centre-right political broadcast 24/7, and recently saw 5 episodes of GB News programmes presented by Tory MPs, which officially showed signs that the Conservatives are mainly dominated, and not their political rivals, the Labour Party. Talk TV began broadcasting on April 25th, 2022, and is home to opinion-oriented content focusing on the news and current affairs. However, similarly to GB News, Talk TV is criticised for lack of impartiality in their broadcasts, potentially putting their range of perspectives at risk. This time, accusations of biases that leaning towards political viewpoints that are shown in the content. Additionally, Piers Morgan, ex-presenter of Good Morning Britain, was a major figure on this channel. He provided his own outspoken and controversial commentary on the day's main events. As for radio coverage, this started in 1927, though at the time there were regular broadcasts of news and entertainment programmes across various news reports. They were likely to cover political events. However, there weren't many dedicated political programmes in the early days. That all changed when in the 1930s political coverage increased, along with programmes being expanded. This included broadcasts of political figures, speeches and debates of national importance. The early 20th century has seen radio become a major source of news and information for the public. This has been seen as a regular fixture on our airwaves, with political and public disclosure at the same time. This is still recognised, however, with very little reported. The number of radio stations that do reports / 24-hour coverage of politics has decreased. This was likely due to the meeting of different audience needs, and this can also contribute to the loss of money that is needed to operate. However, the positives of radio coverage on politics have increased, with a truckload of discussion points across various regional and national radio networks / programmes. This is still mainly in BBC radio networks and some commercial radio stations like the Financial Times, etc. On Monday 9th of June 1975, BBC Radio 4 was the first radio station at the time to broadcast the afternoon coverage of the House of Commons, and one of the MPs that can be heard at the time was then Labour Minister Tony Benn. Since then, 1978 saw the permanent fixture of Radio 4's broadcast from the House of Westminster. However, controversy struck, and that was because the control of Radio 4 attacked the use of radio broadcasting simply by quoting, "Much had been made of furthering the democratic purpose by broadcasting from Parliament," but the BBC's charter held no such requirement. In days like these, we need to have expert guidance on what this will mean to future viewings of politics. We have managed to get 3 people to be interviewed and get their responses in as they talk about the wider scale of politics and the media. This is what they had to say, including the concerns of bias on political reporting and what challenges there are, including differences in media trust among people who might have different political views in the UK.
Well, the political leaning of the media influencers industry as a whole really is just quite affecting, because I mean, you've got the BBC, they'll say what they want. ITV, they'll say what they want. Everyone's different at the end of the day.
In terms of the different media and bias, I think if you look at especially newspapers, the Sun, Rupert Murdoch is very right-wing and supports Conservatives, and like, for example, the opposite, Guardian, are very left-wing and support the Liberals. And in terms of the Ofcom dual ruling, I think that they can't do it, because then I disagree with it. It allows people to have their own voice and not necessarily have people on the television influence viewers.
I think a lot of news publishers, especially these days, aren't particularly unbiased. A lot of them have their own agenda and their own ideas, and they present that rather than presenting an unbiased view.
Well, the concerns can be from rivaling political parties, really, as they can be quite biased in certain situations. And I personally not a big fan of the government when it comes to this bias with they're talking all about.
I think there shouldn't be any concern for about it, because I feel like BBC is the national one. I think if they choose one part, their national broadcaster. I think if they choose one party, everyone will choose that one party because they represent the United Kingdom. But I think they can't be impartial. They have to be impartial, because then it allows different people to choose what they want to do.
I don't think the BBC really have any problems. I think they are mostly impartial, but other smaller news publishers like GB News seem to lean to one side rather than being unbiased.
Well, the differences vary a lot, and the politicians as a whole, they use a lot of things really. Like our local politicians, for example, they have their own Facebook pages and Instagram to sort of show people, whereas the bigger politicians would also have something similar, say Twitter or X as it's known now. They'll have something on there to sort of say their political views and things, but also they also sort of show themselves off with the PMQs, for example.
I think politicians see media as an advantage, because then they can market themselves on social media, and especially if they're not doing that well in votes, they can use the social media to promote them as being amazing.
I think since the news has to be unbiased, politicians can use it to make a better image of themselves and hide the bad stuff they've done.
Well, benefiting the most, I'd probably have to say. Now, I might be wrong here, but I want to say Conservatives. But with them, the benefiting the most, I mean, you got Rishi over here, he's just sort of doing what he wants. It's not really a democracy anymore, it's sort of Rishi says. He says something, he wants it, he's going to try and get it. He doesn't really want anyone else's opinions.
I think people use the political disclosure. I think the newspapers mainly benefit, because they can put a lot of the information, like if a politician makes a mistake, they can put that in the newspaper and it'll be all over. And I think it's a problem, because then if one politician or something has something ruled against them, that gets held against them for the entire campaign.
I think the people who are benefiting the most, probably the current government, the Conservatives and that, because they're going to be in the news the most, and due to the news' unbiased nature, it's mostly going to be perceived as positive.
Well, they get their sources. I feel like with the current day of technology, people are getting their sources more from things like the internet rather than the telly, for example. As, say, you miss something, like said earlier, the PMQs, you can watch that through a website on catch-up. And it's sort of affecting a lot, really. Because, yeah, older people will probably still also be using newspapers to get their political fix.
I think a lot of people use like the news in general, because sometimes if you look on TV after the news, it'll be like, this is a broadcast from whatever party. And I think as well, and like another thing is social media, that like you'll see certain news outlets say this politician has said this.
I think most people in general get it from the internet, some of which will get it from like the BBC News website, but a lot of people will get it from stuff like Instagram and TikTok, which could be a concern because it might not be true or unbiased.
Well, it sort of became like that probably from around the inventions of like the radio and television. Sort of the media and politics as a whole have sort of been one in one since they've invented things to sort of project their ideas, other than, sorry, even as far as back as newspapers. Now that I think about it, there's always been a link with politics and media as a whole.
I think the relationship was partisan when, like, towards the 90s, and I think the AI got involved because then it can probably influence people, but then also, you know, there's a lot of people saying AI could take over jobs and they might end up writing the speeches for politicians, so it's not actually coming from their mouth, it's coming from a computer.
I think it's always been this way, but it's just a lot more prevalent now, and it's a lot more easier for people to spin stories with the current technology.
Well, for the public's perception, it really just sort of just more depends on, say, the person with like more like Generation Z, for example. I feel like they would not be getting as influenced because they're seeing the flaws in our recent government, for example, and they sort of see how the future is going to be for us. Whereas the older generations, they're seeing it face on. They're not going to be living with climate change, for example. Not to make it morbid or anything, but they see it as their own views and not thinking of the future that we will have, and politics and how they perceive it. That's a whole different story, because what we know, they could just be lying on the internet to what we know. They could have completely different thoughts, but simply are saying things to gain public attention.
I think the people's reception is that they kind of just want to get one party. If like one party makes a lot of mistakes, they want to get the next party and just see what they can do. Especially if it's been the same party for about a decade, it can be something that allows change. And I think AI could also influence it, because it could change it for the good and have the right party come in, or bad because then the wrong party could come in.
I think it's a big concern, because the rise of AI is making things a lot easier for these politicians, and it can cause a lot more problems because it doesn't give people the full facts.
The internet did not come around until January 1st, 1983, and the same year that the TV experiment from the Lords came out. This was not until 1998 when BBC News was one of the first news websites to upload a dedicated political section. Then this became the norm for ITV, Sky News websites respectively. However, there was room for one more, and that was online coverage. Parliament Live.tv displays audio and video coverage of all public businesses from across the Commons and Lords chambers and the Committee of UK Parliament. The proceedings go all the way back to the 4th of December 2007, when early suggestions showed that extensive live coverage of across the House was just beginning, and that completes the best of the lot. In the launch of the website, 15 live streams were held, showing the day's coverage across the House and committees uninterrupted, meaning that public did not have to listen to the news whilst watching coverage. It is still there today, although you will have to scan the search bar and held over it to the year 2007 to see the 4th of December endurance to watch the early days of online broadcasting. However, this innovation advancement does not go far enough to be accessible, and that is where another advancement was made. In 2017, the Deafness and Hearing Loss campaign was born to another advancement, BSL interpretation experiments from Westminster Hall. This was to ensure that deaf/hard of hearing people who use BSL as their mother tongue language could access the debate. Whilst availability was led for history in the making at the time, there were separate feeds, one feed for clean feed and the other feed for sign language interpreters, to appear on the split screen format. This was to follow once again in 2018, this time the debate considered for, and I quote from the website, e-petition 200,000, relating to British Sign Language being part of the national curriculum. Once again, this was considered with two separate feeds, one without signing but with the clean feed and the other with split screen format for BSL interpretation. With these two trials and response has been overwhelmingly positive. Feedback from these target audiences. From the media, so TV coverage channels like BBC Parliament Channel, members of Parliament who their voters use BSL and their first language, deaf and hard of hearing loss organisations like the RNID and NCDS, and the deaf/hard of hearing communities as a whole. This became the new norm, as the first House of Commons coverage with BSL interpretation came at a particularly momentous time on the 2nd of February 2020, when Mr. Speaker addressed to the House with the notice of monumentous historical notice, which he and the fellow colleagues around the House are pleased with. Thus, a long history of BSL interpretation on Parliament Live TV is yet to be written. However, the Lords produced this historical meeting with its first ever use of live BSL interpretation. Whilst discussing the BSL bill, turned into act in April 2022, ever since, all oral questions from the Commons have been and are still interpreted into BSL in this day and age. It's unclear when newspapers began reporting on political news. However, historians believe that imprint's coverage of political news began in the 17th century, with the addition to the rise of newspapers and the decrease of written sheets that was used in the 15th and 16th centuries. Printed news did not come out until 1528, and that was not regular publications. Then, the late 20th century saw the introduction of more big newspaper corporations. This includes the Sun, Metro, not the Underground, and the Guardian, Daily Express, and so many others, which was either a dedicated political section or having the whole newspaper report on political stories. Centre-left and centre-right are the terms to describe each newspaper, because 10 newspapers are centre-right to right-wing, because the newspapers support the Conservatives. As for centre-left and left-wing newspapers, due to there are 5 that support the Labour Party due to its nature, that only Labour Party supporters can rely on. For example, they might counter-argue the Conservatives' pledges for a better Britain, and focus on the key history stats of political reporting from different ends of the spectrum. So, we consume news the way we have these days, uncovering the truth, the controversies at the same time, with help from Ofcom the regulator. With this, many more, we can all ensure that political reporting is safe, accessible and accurate to the wider degree of reporting. As we have seen, audiences, numbers, viewership are changing patterns every year from TV to radio and online. If you want to find out more about these changing numbers, head over to the Radio Today website and search Rajar Q4 2023 observations, or head over to Ofcom and search for Media Nations Report 2023.